Hi guys, so 2021 hasn't been the best year for nonfiction so far. Not necessarily in terms of numbers. I don't think that recreationally I've read more or less nonfiction books than in any other given year. But in terms of quality, I think the last book that I talked about on this channel, the last nonfiction book, was Arundhati Roy's Ordinary Person's Guide to Empire, which I think I talked about in March. And since then, I've been collecting them and saving them up in order to make a best and worst of recent nonfiction video. And I've been waiting a long time for the day to come when I would actually have enough good books to talk about that there could be a best of side of the video. And yet the video is still pretty unbalanced. I'm going to start with the worst of and will try to get it over with quickly. So in May, I made a valiant effort to participate in the Springathon, the big nature writing readathon. And the first book that I picked up for that was Edgelands by Farley and Michael Symmons Roberts. This is purportedly a book about the ecosystems that evolve on the edges of our urban centers and in derelict and neglected places, like the scrapyard in the cover image. But in reality, this was just substanceless, self-congratulatory and self-aggrandizing waffle about how oh so very different the oh so artistic and oh so poetic minds of the authors are, because they can see the beauty in old cars and they can write whole book chapters about that, and isn't that just so different and artistic and poetic? Yeah, I got about 2 pages into this book before I closed it and took it to the little free library. And I wasn't much more successful with the second book that I picked up for Springathon, which only confirmed what I already knew or suspected, which is that Kathleen Jamie's brand of nature writing isn't my kind of nature writing. She's neither a scientist nor a scholar, and I personally don't think her style is in any way particularly poetic or creative, and I think that her essays are really just glorified morning journal entries, and there is simply not enough of substance or of poetry for me in her writing. So that bad beginning kind of killed the mood for Springathon, and instead I picked up a new release of spring, and that was Chasing the Thrill by Daniel Barbarisi, which is a kind of documentation of the Fen treasure hunt. I don't know how well known this is. It was complete news for me until I listened to a podcast by Outside Magazine's podcast with an interview with the author shortly before release day. But I'm guessing this is not that well known, particularly outside of the US. So the late Forrest Fenn was a rich art dealer from Santa Fe who, when he was diagnosed with cancer, sort of came face to face with his own mortality and decided that he absolutely had to take steps to ensure his immortality. And in order to do so, he prepared a treasure chest that he filled with objects from his collection and hid somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. He then wrote memoirs and included in them a poem which included clues as to the location of the treasure chest. That was in 2010. The memoirs were released in 2010, and very soon a veritable cult developed around the Fen treasure hunt. A number of people gave up their whole lives and livelihoods in order to dedicate their whole life to the treasure hunt. And a handful of people actually even died in the Rocky Mountains hunting for the treasure. And this book by Daniel Barbarisi is an account of all that and of Forrest Fenn's background. In my opinion, there were two major issues with the book. The first one is that, by all rights, it should have been a long magazine article. There just isn't enough here to fill 350 pages, and all the stories about the treasure hunters were extremely repetitive. And a lot of the book was actually very obviously filler content, like stories about randomly selected other treasure hunts and other treasures from history, when of course we all know and all have an idea of what a treasure and a treasure hunt is. The only thing that I found interesting were the legal questions surrounding ownership of the treasure. But these were dealt with very quickly and not comprehensively, and I was left wanting more in this respect. The second major issue with this book is that it is a very good cautionary tale about how you shouldn't make a book deal about a story like that if the story isn't finished yet. Because it might turn out that it finishes while you are still writing the book, and that the ending is actually extremely anticlimactic. And I don't want to spoil the outcome of the Fenn treasure hunt, but the treasure was found while Daniel Barbarisi was writing the book. And for several reasons, we don't actually get to hear very much about that. And so, just like the story itself, the resulting book is massively anticlimactic as well. And for a 350-page book, it was just too frustrating in the end. So I recommend reading the Wikipedia article instead. An actually pretty wild story that nevertheless didn't result in a good book are Hiroo Onoda's memoirs, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. Hiroo Onoda was one of the so-called holdouts, Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands who were in denial about the outcome of the war, the Second World War, and went rogue, went into hiding, and became guerrilla fighters even after the end of the war. And some of them held out for years on their island. In Onoda's case, it was 30 years. He came to the Philippine island of Lubang as an intelligence agent at the end of the war, and he was the last holdout from a group of 4 who went into hiding on Lubang and became a diplomatic nightmare for Japan because they intermittently terrorized the civilian population of the island and even killed a handful of them. All attempts to make contact with them and convince them that the war had ended failed. And in the end, it was actually a very determined hippie backpacker from Japan who managed to make contact with him in person, with Onoda, the last remaining holdout, and persuaded him to meet with a retired general who then came to Lubang and relieved Onoda of his duties, and he was then repatriated and wrote these memoirs. Fun fact, the backpacker died a few years later in a mountaineering accident in the Himalayas, where he had gone to search for the Yeti. And I believe he would have found him too had he had more time. But Onoda lived to tell his tale, and well, this is it. I have to say, as interesting and fascinating as Onoda's story is, the book is rather disappointing. For one, it glosses over a lot of uncomfortable topics, not the least of which is the killings of the civilians on Lubang. I think Onoda even lies about the number of people that were killed. And there is never any real self-awareness, any real self-examination of the deeper reasons for the soldiers' delusions and their zealousness and their blind faith in the Japanese army and its ultimate victory. And of course, I mean, Onoda was received as something like a war hero when he came back home because of his dedication to duty, which it makes you wonder, in the face of such a personal tragedy, of a guy who spent 30 years in the jungle because of this delusion, why didn't more people start to question if this dedication to duty was actually a good thing? But anyway, in such a situation, why would Onoda begin to put himself on the spot and question his behavior? It's kind of an act of self-preservation, I think, to gloss over these issues in his memoirs. And so the resulting book is kind of an interesting and valuable source for historians, psychologists, sociologists, etc. But I would have preferred to read a book about Onoda that was written by another person and was a lot more critical and discerning. So, an interesting book, but ultimately an unsatisfactory one. And now we are finally getting to the good ones. So, one of my favorite nonfiction reads of recent months is Noam Chomsky's Because We Say So. And what can I say? Noam Chomsky is just one of my all-time heroes. This is a collection of very short pieces, mostly newspaper columns, but also some adapted speeches about issues of the day, current issues from the years 2012 to 2014. But they are unfortunately all issues that are still ongoing today and still very relevant today, like global warming and the threat of nuclear disaster, and coupled with that, the conflict in the Middle East. I think that this would be a very good introduction to Noam Chomsky if you are not already familiar with his politics, because with these ultra short pieces in here, you are getting him distilled Chomsky, and you are not going to be overwhelmed with facts as you are in some of his other essays. For instance, those in the essay collection Hopes and Prospects, which for me were extremely challenging because as a non-American, I am not familiar with almost any of the names, of the hundreds of names mentioned in there. I know the names of the presidents, but that's about it. Vice presidents, chiefs of security and of federal agencies, reporters and journalists, I didn't recognize any of the names, and that made it extremely confusing. And this is not at all an issue in this book. So a good beginner's Chomsky. And lastly, I would like to point out one of the best non-academic history books that I've ever read. And this is The Great Wall, China Against the World, 1000 BC to AD 2000 by Julia Lovell. And cliche as it sounds, this is a tour de force through China's political, military, and foreign history. And the Great Wall serves as kind of the anchor point of the narrative, or the idea, the image of the Great Wall, I should say, because it is Julia Lovell's objective to demonstrate that the Great Wall is a construct. It doesn't actually have a counterpart in reality, not at least in the way that it is portrayed. It is an idea that was actually created by Westerners in the 18th, 19th century and was then adopted and kind of pseudo reappropriated by China in the 20th century. And this image of the Great Wall actually creates an image of China and the Chinese Empire in the West, and also in China itself, an image that is very far from reality. And the book explains how that is. Julia Lovell is a scholar and a researcher of modern Chinese history and literature. And let me tell you, from a historian, you know you're reading a good history book if the author indiscriminately trashes all sides and all players in the game, be they Western or Chinese or Mongolian. This book was just a pleasure to read for me, and I recommend it if you can stomach the kind of writing that isn't actually academic writing but is very close to it. And I'm sure this book gets cited a lot in academic publications too. This was my nonfiction highlight of the first half of the year, and it goes to show that it can actually be very rewarding to read books that have been on your TBR for a long, long time and that you have kind of lukewarm feelings about, because this might be the book that has been on my TBR the longest. It's definitely in the top 10, I would say, or it was. But of course, I haven't learned my lesson, and I went on a little nonfiction shopping spree last week. Only used books, but still. So I've got a mini haul for you here of books that all went onto my immediate pile of possibilities. Because let's not call it a TBR, because we all know that that never works out with me. So this is it. Here we have Dirty Wars by Jeremy Scahill. I'll just read you the blurb. In this shocking expose of America's covert foreign policy operations, Jeremy Scahill uncovers the dirty wars sanctioned by the US president. Wars in which military units operate domestically and globally with direct orders from the White House to hunt down, capture, or kill those designated as enemies in the war on terror. It's unfortunately always timely. I also bought I Am a Strange Loop by Douglas Hofstadter. This is all about consciousness, and I'm just kind of a fan of Douglas Hofstadter's, have been ever since I heard him give a lecture at my university like 3 years ago now, I think. It was a lecture on translation, and it was extremely funny. And he is the son of the physicist after which Leonard Hofstadter from the Big Bang Theory was named. I don't know how well known that is, or Douglas Hofstadter is. I might be telling you things that everybody already knows, but just in case. And then a book on the myth behind the magic flute, die Zauberflöte in German, by Jan Assmann, one of the world's leading Egyptologists. Well, he is retired now, but he used to be. And as in the case with Hofstadter, I am a big fan of Jan Assmann's. I'm not actually that interested in Egyptology and in Egyptian myth in particular, but they have always, or at least for some years now, they have been on the periphery of my own research. So there is kind of a latent, or I feel like I should be interested and knowledgeable about them in some way. But I would never have bought this book if it hadn't been for Jan Assmann. I've been a fan of his ever since I read his cultural theory in my first semester at uni for German studies, actually. I never studied Egyptology. I read him for German studies. He writes cultural theory as well, and he and his wife, Aleida Assmann, actually won the second most important German book prize, I'd say, after our National Book Award, the Friedenspreis des deutschen Buchhandels, but he didn't win that one for his Egyptology. And then I got 2 books by Bella Bathurst. The Wreckers, a story of killing seas, false lights, and plundered ships, and The Lighthouse Stevensons. I think The Lighthouse Stevensons is her more famous one. It's a book about the family that built and owned and maintained most of the Scottish lighthouses, which also happens to be the family and the ancestors of the author Robert Louis Stevenson. And The Wreckers is a kind of related in topic, of course. It's a history of shipwrecks on the British coast. So a good mixture here, I think, on this pile. And because the pile is so diverse, I can't really make up my mind which book to read first. As always, if you have read any of these books, those that I have read and those that I haven't, I would love to hear what you thought about them in the comments. And I hope I've given you some inspiration for upcoming non-fiction reads. And I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye guys, have a nice day.